The 584th edition of the Four Corners podcast starts right now.
This is the Four Corners podcast.
And that could make a difference. Lawson at the buzzer. Got it! Maybe not. Ty Lawson wins it at the buzzer.
Deep three. And Green rips down the rebound in traffic. 4-on-1.
What a great job. What a terrific job in transition. I mean, you couldn't plan that any better as a coach.
Gets the roll. Here we go. Page has it. Carolina down one. 84-83. Page into the front court with 4 seconds. Page to the rim. Got it! He got it! 9/10 of a second to go. Inbounds. Washington gets it to Warren. His full court shot. No good. Marcus Page baby. Does it for the Tar Heels. Carolina wins it.
Don't force it if you're Goss.
Comes in. Blocked by Meeks. Buried up ahead to Jackson. And he tucks it down for the 5-point lead. Matthews off the mark. And this year the confetti is going to fall for North Carolina. They're not going to be denied this time. Inside 30 overall. Love, top of the key. Oh! Big time delivery.
Here are your hosts, Josh Marlowe and Anthony Pagnotta.
Hello and welcome into another live edition of the Four Corners podcast. We are powered by Carolina Electrical Services. Josh and Anthony here with you guys once again on a Tuesday night, finally back into our off-season project, the what-ifs series. We're in the decade of the 1990s, and tonight we're going to tackle the biggest what-ifs from Carolina basketball in that decade. It was an emotional roller coaster of a decade for the program that saw them win a national championship and saw its legendary head coach retire basically out of nowhere. So we'll tackle all the things from the 1990s as we get closer and closer to winding down the What If series. And that's a good thing because next week, fall practice opens all around the country. Carolina will officially begin their preseason stuff. So we got to get done with the offseason content because preseason basketball will be here this time next week. Before we get to the What If series, let's do what we do at the start of every podcast. That's the pod thought of the day. We go to former Carolina football player, now wide receiver for the New England Patriots, Matt Collins for today's pod thought. And that thought is, quote, every day is a competition where you have an opportunity to prove yourself. There are no free lunches, end quote. Mac had a big game on Sunday, scored a touchdown. Of course, he caught that touchdown from former Tar Heel quarterback Drake May. And ever since Matt Collins has left Chapel Hill, he's had a long and lengthy career in the National Football League. He's also proven to be a bit of a character because the guy no longer wears shoes. But he also delivers some great quotes. And I thought that was a great quote here that we could apply to, I think the mindset that, Hubert Davis really wants to try to instill in his program and with this year's squad is every time they walk on the court, man, it's a competition with themselves, a competition against the opponent, a competition to get better and become the best version of a basketball team that they can be. And when this team has struggled like they did last year, like they did a few years ago, they really, I think, failed to meet the competitive standard that Hubert Davis wants from his team. And I think that's still part of him trying to establish the culture that he needs to establish as Carolina's head coach. And, I've kind of said all off season long, once this roster really came together with the addition of Luka Bogovac, is I don't think this team has a bunch of star power on it, which means they're going to have to really go to work every day, pick up their hard hat and go do the hard work in the trenches. And that's where maybe the no free lunches come into play with that part of this quote, because if Carolina is going to ascend to the top of the ACC to become a team that can make the second weekend of the tournament or further, it's going to be done so by competing and playing hard every single night. Because unlike in years past where you had a 2,000-point score or a 1,200 rebounder on the roster, you don't have that. You can't hang your hat on that. You're going to have to work hard every single night to become the best version of themselves. And that journey for this group starts in just over a week.
Yeah, I mean, most of the guys that are on this roster are not proven at the college level. So for them, I mean, this is a group that has to work to prove to everybody in the country that they are worthy of wearing Carolina blue and that they are worthy of being a team that, deserves to be ranked, deserves to be in the NCAA tournament. That's what Carolina has to work towards this year. And you're not starting from scratch, but you've got a lot of guys that haven't necessarily been in the type of expansive roles that they're going to need to be this year for Carolina. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how these guys adjust. The thing that I think you have to realize is that no one's afraid of you because you're Carolina. Like, those days of fearing you because of the name on the front of the jersey is pretty much gone, especially in the NIL era. You've got a lot of guys who are making a ton of money at this rate all around college basketball. And for them, when you look at it, they've seen Carolina, struggle over these last couple of years and not be nearly as strong as they've been throughout the entirety of, what we've been talking about here on the What If series. So, I mean, I think you look at it and this year you feel like the task for this group is pretty simple. It's really just that you got to come to work and bust your tail every day, because if not, then it's going to be hard for you to be able to compete at the level that you want to compete. This ACC, I don't think it's going to be great, but I don't think it's going to be a terrible year in the ACC either. So, I mean, Carolina's got to be ready to go, and you don't want to be a middle of the pack team in the ACC, because that's not going to get you where you ultimately want to go, which is the NCAA tournament.
Yeah, and I think one thing that we'll come to learn with this group, because there isn't a lot of star power on the roster right now, which is if they are good and they do play hard, it makes it easier for us as fans to fall in love with them, to root them, and support them, even if they don't win the way that we want them to win. I think the frustrating part has been not just seeing Carolina lose, but just not seeing Carolina play to the standard and the expectation that this program demands. And that's something that I get really frustrated by. We know the days of going undefeated are long gone. The days of going 36-3, I know Florida just did it, but even like those are going to be outliers in the era now where you're playing as many high-profile non-conference games. You're playing at least 18 conference games, if not more, depending on what league you're in. Like, you're going to lose, but can you lose while still looking like a team that plays hard and competes and looks like Carolina? I think, if this team, does lose, but they lose that way, I think it'll be easier for us as fans to kind of process, as opposed to watching this team when they have gotten beaten, kind of get blown out, kind of get embarrassed, and not really, meet the standard that the last 60-plus years have laid out before them. So we're getting excited for the upcoming season, but we're still excited about this offseason project. It's been a lot of fun just kind of looking back at some of the key pivotal moments in Carolina basketball history that have kind of defined what this program is today and why we love it so much, and kind of look at it just from like alternate angles and perspectives. And so, we started back in the 1950s. We made our way through the 1960s, the 1970s. It's been a while, but we did the 1980s a little bit ago. Now we're up to the 1990s, just 3 more decades to climb before this offseason project does come to a close. And so let's go ahead and get right to tonight's order of business, looking back at the 1990 decade, which was, as I mentioned, an emotional roller coaster for the program as they would win their second national championship under legendary coach Dean Smith, but also would see him retire just before the 1997-1998 season. And so let's go through some key moments in this decade, and let's go back to 1991. You go back to that Final Four. That's the first ever meeting between Roy Williams and Coach Smith, where Roy Williams was the coach at Kansas, and they quote unquote upset Carolina in the Final Four, where they would advance to the national title game. That's a game where Coach Smith famously got ejected. Roy Williams would always reference that and kind of say that, he felt bad for him just because he felt like he didn't deserve to be, ejected from the game. And, for Roy Williams, that moment almost overshadowed the first big moment of his career, which was, of course, guiding the Jayhawks to the Final Four and to the national championship game. The interesting storyline that comes out of this is that if Carolina wins that game and they make the national title game, who do they meet in that final? They meet Duke. That was the first of two championships for Duke when they went back to back. And so, the what if that I have is, if Carolina beats Kansas and they advance to that national championship game, do they deny Duke and Coach K their first national championship? And then maybe we'll talk about this just in a minute. We've seen Duke and Carolina on the Final Four stage, but could we ever try to imagine and process seeing those two teams play on a neutral court with the national championship in the balance? For many people, they thought that's when that was on the precipice, and it didn't happen, that it would never happen. Of course, it happened back in 2022, but I think there's a lot of kind of cool what ifs there, because if that team gets to the national championship game, maybe, just maybe, Coach K has one less national title to his name than he has today.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is possible. I mean, you were talking about them going for their first national championship. It would have been a bet against your biggest rival. Now, I don't know, is this before or after Coach K made the comments about Coach Smith?
It's after. He made the comments about Coach Smith in '84.
So there you go. So you've got the vitriol. You've got basically the heightened or the height of this rivalry is you're basically in the middle of that. And so at that point, I mean, yeah, you're talking about the biggest game that's ever happened in college basketball. And remember that college basketball now is popular. But back then, college basketball was more popular than college football was more popular. I mean, I'm not going to say than the NFL, but it was definitely on the level of, probably where, the NBA was at that time as well, where the NBA was held in as high a regard as any sport in the four major sports. I mean, it was up there. That was really the time where it was shifting from baseball, going to basketball, and then before it eventually converted over to now football, which seems like it's never really going to be touched. That was the moment where basketball was popular. So during those times, it would have been unbelievable to see these two sides match up with each other. I could not imagine the stress that fans would have been going through, seeing that as the game that was, would determine a national champion. And again, it's one of those situations, we talk about it when it comes to 22, that's an ultimate trump card when it comes to the, what's happened even the last few years. I mean, granted, Carolina has had their fair share of success since then against Duke. It's not like they have gone winless since that point, but at the same time, it is something that, we will still use to this day whenever you get into an argument with a Duke fan. Well, at least we've got that Final Four. You would have been able to say the same thing back then. And, I think if you look at those two teams and the way that they match up, if you just look at Carolina, they had Rick Fox, who was a senior at that time, probably, one of the better Carolina players not to win a national championship. Hubert Davis was on that roster, which I think that would be really interesting if he had that national championship as a player and was, of course, now the head coach for Carolina. You had a young George Lynch. You had Pete Chilcutt, who was a veteran at that point, was a senior on that roster. But then you also had some guys like Eric Montross, Derek Phillips. Those are the types of guys that were the young guys, the freshmen on that team. That team was as deep as just about any team that we'll talk about Not to mention you got a guy in King Rice who was really leading everything for Carolina at the point guard spot at the time. I mean, yeah, that's a crazy group that could have gone there and found a way to upset them. Or I don't even know if it would have been considered an upset. I mean, Carolina going into the NCAA tournament that year had just 5 losses. They were really good, and they end up getting beat by Kansas. Really, that was the upset that everyone thought. So, I mean, as a number 1 seed in the East, I think Carolina probably would have been one of the favorites to win the national championship going into that year. And I do think that there's a good chance that Carolina would have been able to deny Duke that national championship, which would have been so sweet for Carolina. That would be one that we would still hold to this day. And especially if it was part of the reason why Coach K didn't have more national championships. Now, I mean, could he have stumbled into another one somewhere along the way after they eventually first won or they won that national title the next year? Yeah, I think that certainly is possible. But I think that, if he ends up winning the national championship, if Dean Smith wins that title over him, I think that's probably the decider in who is the greatest coach of all time, because you literally watch these guys play for a title. And I think if Dean Smith wins it, that's what ultimately decides it between those two.
Yeah, because if he gets that national championship and you assume 93 still happens, we kind of talked about this at different points back in the 70s when they made the final or whatever. But that would give him 3 titles. And now you're in a real classified group of coaches to win 3 national championships. And then if you have one over, Coach K, even if he has one more in totality, if you have one head to head, when you do these arguments and debates, well, then you have one over him, and maybe that tips the scales in your favor. And I think for me, like, as you try to look at it through an unbiased lens, I do think if Carolina gets there, if they don't get beat by Kansas, I think they beat that Duke team, because if you look at that Final Four, it was a Final Four of upsets. No one thought Kansas would beat Carolina. No one thought Duke would beat UNLV, considering what happened to Duke the previous year when they got beat by 37 by the Running Rebels. That Kansas team, you had Adonis Jordan, but you had a third-year head coach in Roy Williams. Them making the Final Four was as big a surprise as them, playing for the national championship. And so I do think if Carolina would have got to Monday night with some of that veteran leadership that was on that roster, I do think that maybe prevails over the Duke team that they would have gone up against. And think about that. Like, if that 91 team wins a national championship, I maybe I'm wrong about this. I think we have different grace for Hubert Davis as a head coach right now, because he would have been a national champion player, and in his first year as a head coach would have taken the program to a national championship game. Like, I do think the way that we evaluate him would be a little bit different, because we could see that he had championship pedigree as a player and as a coach. And, just trying to process that game, because, I think as big a deal as it was in 2022, and it was a pretty big deal, as you mentioned, college basketball as an entity, not as popular today as it was 30 years ago. It's big here because we live in college basketball country. But back then, college basketball was a national sport, where now college basketball has kind of morphed into baseball, kind of morphed into hockey. It's a regional sport. There's areas in the country where it's really, really popular, and there's some areas in the country that don't give a dang. That wasn't the case in 91. Like, you could have made the argument that would have been, the biggest game the two teams ever played, the most watched game they've ever played, and would have set so many records, I think, for TV viewership, because, in 91, you're talking about just 6 years of the expanded tournament. Like, you're still in the early stages of March Madness really establishing itself as the event we know it to be today, which, for my money, it's the best 3-week sporting event we have in North America. You're still in the early stages of that, because the tournament didn't expand to 64 teams until 1985. If you would have gotten a final of those two teams, that would have propelled the sport to an even different level that unfortunately, the sport could not kind of recreate in 2022.
Mm-hmm.
I thought when they met 2022, it was great because I do think it helped get eyeballs back on the sport for maybe people that had kind of, because of the one and done era, had kind of fallen out of love with college basketball. But if this happens in 91, I think it really catapults it to a level where maybe that momentum carries a lot further than it ultimately did. And so, this one's twofold because you would have loved to have a national championship for Dean Smith, but you're also you would have been denying a national championship appearance for Roy Williams and his Kansas team, and so that kind of just makes that connection between those two programs just all the more unique, and it's what makes those two programs so similar in a lot of different ways. Unfortunately, it wasn't meant to be, and unfortunately, Duke would go on to win the national championship. Let's flash forward really quickly to 1993, where Carolina this time would beat Kansas in the Final Four. They'd advance to the national championship game, where, of course, they would beat the Fab Five. They'd beat the Michigan Wolverines and get Coach Smith his second national championship. And, when we did the 1980s, we talked about what if Michael Jordan never hits the shot? Does Carolina still prevail against Georgetown? I think there's a bigger question mark to that one. I think people forget that when Chris Webber called the timeout he did not have, Carolina was still winning the game by 2. Like, Michigan had to score. The game wasn't tied. Carolina wasn't trying to get a stop, or Carolina didn't need to get a stop to then try to go down and score and win the game. They just needed to get one stop to win the national championship. I think because so much is focused on Weber, I think it kind of gets lost in translation that Carolina was winning the game when he called the timeout. And of course, when he took the travel, that wasn't called as well. And so I think this one's just kind of point blank simple. If Chris Webber doesn't call timeout, if that possession plays through, do you trust Carolina enough to get that stop they need to still emerge and cut down the nets as national champions?
Yeah, I would trust them at that point. I mean, you've been through a lot of different tests, not only that season, but I mean, your coach has been through a lot of different tests before. This one was no different for him. This was just another game for him, where I think everybody else had hyped it up like, look, this is the Fab Five. This is a team that just seems destined to win a national championship. I trust that Carolina finds a way to make a stop, because look at how tough they'd played them that entire game. I feel like they had done a really good job of keeping those guys mostly in check. And I feel like they probably do the same thing again at the end of, in that final possession. And so I truly believe that Carolina comes out with that national title. I think that everybody thought that it was that Michigan team that was destined. Meanwhile, it was that Carolina team that, didn't have the type of talent I think that they've had on some of these other rosters that fell short of national championships. Now, not to say that they didn't have NBA talent. I mean, they had 5 guys on this roster that eventually went to the NBA, but it just felt like this was a team that, especially a guy like Donald Williams, wasn't necessarily as recognized during those times, wasn't really recognized even to this day when it comes to Tar Heel fans. I don't think when you think back to some of the program greats that you really think about Donald Williams and how special of a year and how special of a Final Four he had that year for Carolina. You think a lot of, Eric Montross, you think of George Lynch, but Donald Williams feels to be that guy that just kind of gets left out there, even though he had a really strong season and really carried you once you got to the Final Four. So, I mean, yeah, I think, this national title is one that when we discuss this national title, it's always the one that I feel like for Carolina fans probably gets remembered the least. Out of the more modern day ones, like everybody remembers 82. They remember how great that team was. They put that up there with the all-time greats. Same thing with the 09 team. That's a team that's right up there with the all-time greats in the history of college basketball, and a team that was on a mission to win a national championship. And the same thing with 2017. That was a team that was trying to avenge what happened to them the previous year. Everybody got behind that story. This one, I don't know if there was really as much behind it. I guess the matchup, they did end up meeting Kansas once again. They end up beating them. That one, I guess, didn't have nearly the storyline that the previous one did, as you talked about, with Coach Smith getting ejected from that game. So you didn't have that angle on it. And then, facing off against the Fab Five, I think everybody always remembers, because it's been, sort of pounded into us over the years, that the Fab Five was a team that was so great. It almost feels like they did win the national championship. And I feel like a lot of people sort of forget that, yeah, this great team didn't win the title that year. So it's the most forgotten about title, I think, that Carolina has in terms of the national landscape. For Tar Heel fans, I think it's the least talked about title, but it's a very, very important one for the legacy of Dean Smith. And that's why I think it really is so special that Carolina got it done against a team that caliber in Michigan. And I truly believe they would have found a way to pull it out, because I don't think Coach Smith was going to let them lose that game.
Yeah, I think no matter what, I think that team wins the national championship, because it's not the direct comparison from what 2017 had to do, where they had to avenge a national championship loss from the previous year at the buzzer. But you had some dudes that were there in 91, that were back in 93, that just were not going to be denied their one shining moment. And I think, it gets forgotten about, because it wasn't a sexy team. Like it was literally a team that I've kind of talked about what maybe Carolina has to be this year. It was just a team that went out and played as a unit. They did the dirty work. They did the little things. They weren't flashy. It wasn't the best offensive team. It wasn't, the best defensive team, but it was just a group that came together, that played for one another, and it rose to the top of the sport. And the biggest thing it did was not that he needed validation, but, you're talking about for Dean Smith, a guy that, up until 1991 ran the state. Ran the league. And because of Duke's back-to-back national championships, all of a sudden the rival down the road's got more titles than he does, despite Dean Smith being in Chapel Hill longer and having established Carolina as a perennial power for a much longer period of time. But all of a sudden he has to measure up to K. And so I think that's the big thing about that championship, was they finally responded to Duke when the rivalry was really peaking and was at its apex, and we'll talk about it here in just a minute with one of the next what-if scenarios. And so he didn't need validation, but, it is one of those things, and some of the things we talk about kind of off camera, if he never gets a second national championship and he has all these Final Fours and one title, yes, to Carolina basketball, he was still the godfather. He would still be the so much responsible for what we know and love today. But I do think it would have impacted his legacy from the national perspective, because you can get to all these Final Fours, but at some point you got to cut down the nets. And so, you're talking about a guy that went to 11 Final Fours, only has 2 national championships. If it's 11 Final Fours and 1 national championship, then I think it even, it makes it even harder to really talk about his place in the sport. I think the second one solidified him, at least in my opinion, on the Mount Rushmore of college basketball head coaches. And I don't know how you order yours from 1 through 4, but I do think the second one secured his spot as one of the 4 best coaches the sport had ever seen.
Yeah, I mean, it's confusing because, for us, we're guys that believe that he's not even the greatest basketball coach in Carolina basketball history. We believe that Roy Williams is the greatest coach. So that would mean that he is on the Mount Rushmore. That would mean you gotta, as much as I hate him, you gotta have Coach K up there. And then you just have to fill that other spot. Are you going with John Wooden? Are you going with Bob Knight? Are you going with Adolph Rupp, someone, I mean, there's so many different names that you could throw up there, but I think, that's probably the moment that he got himself up there. And, what sucks is that he had another chance to get it done in 1996, 97. He had that opportunity to get it done that year. And he falls just short there. But I mean, there were so many other opportunities that it felt like just slipped by the wayside for him as well. And that's the thing. You wonder if he gets 1 or 2 of those, and especially if he finds a way to get it done in 91, then I mean, you're talking about the greatest coach. There's no debate in the history of college basketball, especially if he's even with Coach K on national championships and K doesn't stumble into one somewhere else along the way. I don't really think there's any sort of debate. And that's the thing that I think probably pains a lot of Carolina fans. As someone that wasn't even, I was born, but I was incredibly young. I mean, not even a year old when Coach Smith decided to step away. I mean, I can't even imagine being a fan during that time and having to think back to that and think how many great opportunities this great man had to win more national championships and just fell short. So you talk about some of the biggest what ifs in the history of the program. I think a lot of them surround Dean Smith because there were so many opportunities for him to bring home national championships, so many great teams, but injuries along the way or, things just not breaking the right way in terms of some of the matchups that he got ultimately leaves him with 2 national titles, which is enough to get him up on the Mount Rushmore, but not enough to make him the GOAT of the sport.
Yeah, and I think that's my argument when it comes to Dean and Roy, because a guy we work with, Chris McLean at WFNZ, could not believe I had this opinion, which one tells you how much the guy just does not listen to anyone says outside of when he's talking, which is almost all the time, because I've made this comment known on the air. I mean, I've been at the station almost 4 years, and I've said it on the air a handful of times. I've always leaned Roy over Dean, and yes, I know he got 90% of what he does from him, but you look at the teams that were supposed to win national championships. Roy Williams they achieved that more often than not than Dean Smith did. 2005 was preseason number 1. They win the national championship. 2009, preseason number 1. They win the national championship. 2016, preseason number 1. They make the national championship. And in 2017, not preseason number 1, but a 1 seed. They get back to the Final Four. They win the national championship. And so, yes, he has less Final Fours, but he has more national titles. And I know you got to get to the Final Four to win a national championship, but I'd rather have more championship wins and less Final Four appearances than more cracks at the apple and come away shorthanded or empty-handed as many times as Dean Smith did. Let's move on to our next what if from the 1990s. We're having a blast here looking back at just a big decade in Carolina basketball history. Tyler Hansbrough, for all of his, success and accolades, all-time ACC leading scorer, all-time leading scorer at Carolina, national champion, national player of the year, 4-time All-ACC, 4-time All-American. I still think the thing he is most known for Carolina fans, and maybe still most beloved for, is the fact that he never lost in Durham. He was 4-0 in Cameron, the first and only player ever to win 4 times in that building and not suffer a single loss. Remember, R.J. Davis could have tied him with the win this past year at Duke, but would have had a loss on his ledger. That did not happen, though. Carolina got blown out when they went to Durham last season. But Rasheed Wallace and crew, also had a real good shot. And they stayed 4 years at the time, and this was kind of right at that point in the college basketball era where guys would maybe stay 1 year. The one and done wasn't yet a thing, but two and done was really starting to become popular. And Rasheed Wallace was a two and done player for UNC. But after he won at Cameron in his second time, he said after the game, quote, "We ain't ever losing over here." And so what I thought it'd be kind of interesting to do is kind of think about if Rasheed Wallace would have stayed 4 years. And then if you look at how those rosters would have stacked up, you would have had an insane abundance of NBA talent that would have overlapped itself. If Rasheed Wallace and Jerry Stackhouse and those guys don't turn pro as early as they do, does Rasheed Wallace become the first ever Tar Heel, the first ever ACC player to go 4-0 inside Cameron Indoor Stadium?
I mean, it's possible. I think that certainly is something that would have been on the table. Now, I mean, you look at that 1995-96 team. I mean, that's a team that was 21-11. They were a 6 seed, lost to Texas Tech in the second round of the tournament. That was one of the lesser teams that we had seen in a while under Dean Smith. Now, a lot of that was because of the youth that was on the roster. I mean, you had Antoine Jameson, who was a freshman at the time. You had Vince Carter, who was a freshman. Shammond Williams as a sophomore, forced into a bigger role. Jeff McGinnis, expected to really shoulder the load for Carolina as a junior, as one of the veterans on that team. Same thing with Dante Calabria. So, I mean, yeah, I think it certainly is possible that team could have run the table. Now, I'm going to tell you, if they keep both those guys, I don't know if they end up landing Antoine Jameson or Vince Carter. I think there's a chance that both of those guys don't end up landing at Carolina because they wouldn't have gotten the immediate playing time. I think that was part of the reason that Carolina was probably able to land those. That was probably part of the recruiting pitch to those guys. It would have been interesting if they would have been able to somehow get all of those guys on the roster together, because at that point, you'd imagine that 95-96 goes a little bit different. And if they stay all the way through their senior year, you would imagine that 96-97 goes a lot different as well. Instead of losing in the national semifinal to Arizona, I mean, does that team find a way to take it all the way to the national championship game? With everything that they had, it would have been a much different lineup. I think you do kind of wonder, would Rasheed have been able to play with Antoine Jameson? Maybe Rasheed is your center. Sorry, Serge Zwicker. I mean, I know you were a guy that did, a decent amount in your time there at Carolina. You have your career that has its special moments as well. But, I mean, if you had a guy like Rasheed Wallace and you could put him at the 5 and then have Antoine Jameson at the 4, I think Carolina fans would have signed up for that all day, and that would have been a force on the inside for Carolina that would have been very difficult to match, especially in that 96-97 season. So I think that's kind of where, my mind goes is, yeah, maybe, with the guarantee that they weren't going to lose there, maybe that does end up happening for Carolina. But most importantly, I think you really wonder, you look ahead to that 96-97 season, really makes you wonder, do they end up getting a championship on the way out for Dean Smith? That would have been something special at that time. It probably would have been one of the more special moments in Carolina history. But that's one that I think it just, remains one of the bigger what ifs, because those guys, went on to have very successful NBA careers. I mean, Jerry Stackhouse was a guy that was in the league for a while, not nearly as successful, not nearly as good of a player as Rasheed Wallace was, but both of those guys, extensive NBA careers, so they likely wouldn't change how it worked out for them.
Am I a bad fan for being glad that Rasheed Wallace went to the NBA early and did not achieve this? Because I got to experience watching Tyler Hansbrough never lose a game at Duke.
I mean, it's questionable. It's questionable fandom, but I mean, I think the thing is that for us, like we just talked about why we believe, and everything that you said is the reason that I believe that Roy is the greatest of all time in Carolina history as well when it comes to coaches. I mean, with Tyler, that's part of the reason why he is the GOAT, because nobody else has achieved that. And now, I mean, we find it really hard to believe that there is ever going to be somebody else that's going to achieve that. I mean, yeah, it's possible. One day along the way, there could be someone that stays for 4 years. The biggest thing for me is, are you going to find somebody with that level of impact that contributes to a 4-year? There might be a guy that's a walk-on, that's part of Carolina never losing in Cameron Indoor or something like that, that stays for 4 years. But I just don't know if we're ever going to see a player that contributed the way that he did that will be able to accomplish the same thing. And so for us, I think that's just another feather in the cap. And that's part of the reason why we wouldn't change the history, because that's such a telling stat. And that's also part of the reason, this is the other thing. We make the argument that he's the greatest in the history of the ACC. That is another thing that we use when we make that argument is, hey, man, he went undefeated in Cameron. How many guys can actually do that? If this was accomplished by Rasheed Wallace and Jerry Stackhouse, then it's not nearly as special. So I do think I understand where you're coming from. But, yeah, it's maybe questionable fandom,
Well, I mean, I'll preface this by saying, in 2006, I was not yet watching every North Carolina basketball game. I was 10 years old. Basketball had become my sport. I had fallen in love with it, but I wasn't staying up and watching them play like I obviously do now, as someone that is first a fan, but writes a blog, hosts a podcast about the team. But I know all 4 of those games. I remember watching all 4 of those games. I remember seeing him hit the 3 on JJ Redick's senior night. When no one gave Carolina a chance in Hades to go into that building and win the game, kind of like they didn't give us a chance in 2022 to go in that building and win. And so, that's why I say that I would not want to trade this, because those moments are the early benchmarks and really the foundation for the love affair and now just the obsession with Carolina basketball. No, Tyler Hansbrough is not my favorite Carolina basketball player of all time. He's not. He wasn't my favorite player when I was watching them play. I was a big fan of Ty Lawson. I've always loved the guards. But he's the focal point of all of my earliest memories of watching this team and watching the program. And these Duke games that I can remember, because this was back when, my dad was a better sports fan than he is today, where my dad got mad. My dad got nervous to watch those games. And so he got kind of instilled into me about how much we hate them and all this type of stuff. And you're watching this unathletic kind of goofball just go out there and kick butt. And I would never want to trade that for anything in the world. And so I do think if Sheed stays 4 years, I don't think Rasheed Wallace loses, because ball don't lie, Sheed don't lie. But I'm glad that he went to the NBA and allowed me to get the experience, the thing I got to experience with Tyler Hansbrough, becoming the first and only player to win 4 times in that building without suffering a loss. And you're right. It's hard to say something will never be accomplished again. But I find it hard to believe in this era of player movement that a player will stay at UNC for 4 years and will walk into that building and not suffer a defeat. I want it to happen. I'm open for it happening, because for many Carolina fans, when we lose to Duke because what happened in 22, it don't hurt them. They just go watch Caleb Love hit the shot and they feel better about themselves. I'm not one of those guys. When we lose to them, my life sucks. When we lose to them, I don't sleep. When we lose to them, I'm depressed. So I would like to get back to beating them more often than we have since 2022. I just find it hard to believe that that's going to be the case. Let's now get to the last kind of what if from the 1990s. And I guess it's obviously going to circle around the retirement of Dean Smith, and just kind of what if things would have transpired in a different light. The first thing I'll ask is, the year before he retired, Carolina got to the Final Four, lost to Arizona in the semifinals. That Arizona Wildcat team would go on to win the national championship. And I think it's easier to believe that if he wins and retires, maybe not as big a surprise as it would become later that year when he would retire right before fall practice would begin for Carolina basketball. So the first what if is what if Carolina wins the national championship in 1997? Do you think that persuades him to maybe stay on a little bit longer, considering he just climbed the mountaintop one more time?
Yeah, maybe it does make him, consider that. I think there's a good chance that he probably does end up retiring, though, and does go out on top. And I think that would have been the best thing for him to do. I think that would have been probably the perfect ending to his career. And again, at that point, I just don't know if Roy Williams is able to outperform that. Even if he would have had the same number of national titles, you're talking about a man that literally, knowing he would have been the only one at that time that would have known that I am retiring at the end of the season. And he still finds a way to win a national championship. This is probably the one that I would want the most, because you look at the collection of players here as well, and this roster was just loaded. This is one that, again, when you look at it, you wonder to yourself, how did this team lose 7 games? How is it even possible? Because you had Antoine Jamison as a sophomore. 19 points a game, 9 rebounds a game. The kid was just a freak. He was a monster at that point. Shammond Williams, as good as he was, 14 a game. 4 assists per game. Shammond kind of playing the point guard role for that team, because believe it or not, Carolina started a starting lineup in the national championship game of Shammond Williams, Vince Carter, Ademola Okalaja, Antoine Jamison, and Serge Zwicker. Those were the guys that played the most in that game. You had Ed Cota, who came off the bench for Carolina at that time. And you do wonder, maybe if Ed Cota at that point was what Ed Cota would become, would Carolina have been able to still win the national championship, even if they do run out the lineup that they did? That group, there were some special players on that team. You're talking about, a program legend in Ed Cota, guys that I think are in the category as some of the best forwards that Carolina has ever had, in Antoine Jamison and Vince Carter, both guys that are program legends in and of themselves. And so I really think that, if he ends up winning that title, you're talking about pretty much the teams that were stacked. He found ways to win titles with those teams. At least the core for most of those runs would have had national championships. You would have felt like most of the ones throughout the history of Carolina, it was pretty accomplished. Maybe the only one that you wouldn't feel like accomplished the national championship, the one group that fell short, that core, would be Kenny Smith and Brad Daugherty. Other than that, I think you would feel pretty satisfied. This is one that sticks in the craw, I think, of a lot of Tar Heel fans, including myself, because, that would have been special to see Antoine Jamison and Vince Carter end up winning a national championship at Carolina, because they were such special players. It just didn't work out for Carolina. It didn't work out in 1997, where they get beat by an upstart Arizona team that wins a national championship. I do believe that if Carolina gets to Monday night, they probably do end up beating Kentucky to win that national title, because they put up a better fight against Arizona than Kentucky did in the national championship game. And then, I think the other question is, what if Dean Smith stays another year longer? That's probably the other question that you had there. And that's probably a team right there that ends up winning the national championship as well. I know Utah was another team that felt destined to make it to that final Monday night after they had pulled some upsets to get to the Final Four. But I really do feel like if Carolina gets to that final Monday night, one of those two times, I think Dean Smith probably finds a way to get a national championship out of it.
Yeah, I always look at, like, when I evaluate Dean Smith as a coach, and you do the not so cool thing, which is like nitpick the negative.
Yeah.
I always hold 84 and 97 against him. Because I do feel like Roy Williams with 84, they get to the Final Four. I think Roy Williams with 97, I think they win the national championship, just because his track record would suggest with those teams, he is going to maximize every bit of the talent that was on the roster. And so you know, that's one where you just, it's really, I mean, it's hard to fathom when you look at that 97 roster. It's hard to believe they don't win a national championship. And it's really hard to think that after 93, you know, you look at all the great players that came through the program: Wallace, Stackhouse, Carter, Williams, Coda. Like, these guys maybe got to the grand stage of they got to the most part, they got to a Final Four. But these are guys that are top 15, 20 players of all time that aren't winning national championships. And it's
didn't even make it to national championships.
Yeah, it's really it in one respect, it just really shows you how hard it is to win a national title.
Yes.
And it's why I still maintain and defend, you know, it's still the hardest championship to win, because there isn't a single other title where you got to win 6 elimination games in a neutral environment. And sometimes you're in different time zones, 3 different weekends, like that happens. That doesn't happen in the other sports. But that's the reality of college basketball with the way that they handle the NCAA tournament. So, you wonder if he wins in 97, does he walk away? Because, you know, he always said that his biggest regret was that he retired too early, and that, you know, he loved the practice, he loved coaching, he loved the games, but because he was the figure that he was, where he was, I mean, he was, and it's going to get the same way if Hubert Davis establishes himself as it. Like, Dean Smith was the most visible part of the university, was maybe the most visible figure in the state of North Carolina. Like, if he would have ran for Senate, he would have won in a landslide, just because of how revered he was within the state. It was the same thing with Roy Williams, where he was the most visible part of the university, and was, you know, right there with Coach K, two of the most visible figures within the state. He didn't know how to handle that stuff back then, because no one knew how to handle stuff like that. You didn't have the stuff you have today, where you've got secretary, and he had a secretary, but I mean, today he didn't have the PR. He didn't have a Steve Kirshner. He didn't have all the people that could literally just say, you coach basketball, we'll take care of the crap. He had to do all the crap and coach, and it exhausted him. And so that's why he always told Roy Williams, don't retire so soon, because he didn't want to quit coaching in 97, but he was just so burnt out. But I do wonder, if you win that national championship, does that recharge the batteries? Do you come back? But as you mentioned, the second thing is, I mean, people forget he retires. They hand it over to Bill Guthridge, which was always the plan. And I think it's important to remember, Roy Williams was closer to going to coach in the NBA in 1997 than he was to come back to coach North Carolina. Like, he had fallen so out of love with recruiting at the college level that he was borderline on the verge of going to the NBA. That what restored his faith in recruiting was the reason why he didn't come back in 2000 when he recruited Nick Collison and Kirk Heinrich and Drew Gooden. Those guys restored his faith in the college process. So he was never on the table to come back in 97 or, you know, to leave Kansas then. It was always going to be Bill Guthridge. But it does just make you wonder, if Dean's on the bench for that group that got to the Final Four, does his 36 years of experience win out over a long tenured assistant, but a guy who was the first time being a head coach? And it's the biggest the second what if is that if they win in 98, then what happens? Just because I don't think he, even if he quits, it directly changes the timeline of the program, where you have 3 years of Guthridge. You go through the Doherty experience before you get Roy Williams to come back in 2003.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird because if you end up winning the title, and let's say he's still hungry for more and wants to continue even just for a few years more, well, then all of a sudden, does that push back the timeline of Bill Guthridge, or does Bill Guthridge get too old and you still end up having to go the Matt Doherty route? Ultimately, the thing that you would wonder is, does it find a way to affect Roy Williams eventually coming back to Carolina? And I don't think it does. I think eventually Roy would have found his way back, even if, let's say, Bill Guthridge coaches, the Matt Doherty years and then decides to step away. I think at that point, Roy Williams was probably ready to come back to Chapel Hill. And so I think he probably still does end up making that decision to come back, but you never really know. That's one of those things where if you say, hey, if you could go back and convince Coach Smith to coach another year, would you do it? I mean, you'd say yes, because you'd want to see if he could win that national title, but you do run that danger of, hey, one thing that could happen on an alternate timeline is that you do end up losing Coach Williams. He doesn't end up coming back to Chapel Hill because of how things eventually play out. So I think that's really interesting. That's what makes these what-if scenarios so tempting to go through, because I mean, the thing is if you change one thing, what does that do to some of the other championships? What does that do to some of the coaching hires, to some of the recruiting? What does that do to those things? That really makes you wonder, because, I mean, you could say even with the Matt Doherty, let's say Matt Doherty never happens for some reason. You could say, okay, well, that's great. We don't have to worry about the Doherty years. Okay, well, even if Roy ends up coming back, if you don't have the Doherty years, that means there's a chance that you don't have Sean May. There's a chance that you don't have Raymond Felton. Some of those guys that were recruited, Rashad McCants, as much as we hate to say it, you don't have those guys. And those were key guys in that 2005 national championship year. So if you don't have those guys, if you don't have Jawad Williams as well, does Carolina end up winning a national championship, or is that a team that's led by true freshman Marvin Williams? And what does that group actually look like? Are they a team that's actually capable of winning a national championship? Who really knows? So that's the thing, man. When you get into those alternate timelines and stuff like that, things can get messed up really quick. So, I wish we did get to see 97, 98 play out, and maybe that would have been the last year of Dean Smith, and then it goes to Bill Guthridge and eventually on to Matt Doherty. But if you told me that, hey, there's a chance that it ends up costing you Roy Williams coming back to Carolina, I'd probably tell you I wouldn't trade it. I got to be honest.
Yeah, I don't think I could ever want to envision a world where Roy Williams wasn't my coach, where that's the guy that was on the sidelines when I got introduced into the program. And, I hold him in the highest regard of people. I mean, one of the biggest joys of my life was meeting the man and then sitting in a gym with him while he watched his grandson play pickup basketball, while I watched my little brother play pickup basketball. Just two dudes loving ball, not talking, but like that's how special it is. So I would never want to envision anything like that, but I do look at it and think that if he's on the bench in 97, 98, and of course that Kentucky team would avenge from 97, they'd get back to the Final Four, they'd win the national championship. I think Carolina gets the job done. And then we're talking about he's got 3, and now he's in the rarefied air, but it does mess up the timeline. And as difficult as it was to experience and all, we didn't live it because we were so young. the Doherty experience, I'll always say, I think was a necessary for Carolina fans because it had gotten so good, and we'll talk about this when we do the 2000s. But they'd gotten so spoiled that they needed to be reminded that not everyone wins the way that we win. And that's a great reminder for where we are now with Hubert, where, as we talked about earlier this offseason, we played that Randolph Childress audio. Literally every program in the league except Duke would die to have the 4 years that Hubert Davis has experienced. But because of Dean Smith, because of Roy Williams, we feel like he's not measuring up. Hopefully we get back to doing more of that starting this year. But I'll always say the Doherty thing was necessary for Carolina fans. I think for the Carolina administration, I think even for the family almost, it was almost something they had to go through. Because I think on the back end where we see where the relationship is repaired and he does go back to Chapel Hill, it did really kind of test how much the family was an actual family. And could you support someone while they were down? And in a lot of ways, Carolina did not do that, but in a lot of ways, Carolina was there to pick Matt Doherty up when he needed to be picked up. And, the 1990s, man, this was when I knew when we got to this part of the What If series, this was going to pick up. Yes, there's a lot known about the 80s. Obviously, with how much I've read and studied and kind of memorized, I've got a pretty good grasp of the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. But the 90s on, man, I know this program like the back of my hand. And some of these scenarios, as you mentioned, like if this was the Avengers and you had the TVA and you had different timelines, this looks completely different.
This is deep stuff, man. This is deep.
And excited for the 2000s, and then we'll wrap up with the 2010s, but was excited to get to the 1990s. Heck, I'm just glad we got to get here because the biggest what if I was asking myself is what if we never finish this daggum project? Because it felt like every time we scheduled a what if episode, news would come down, schedule would come out, a presser would pop up, something of that sort. So we've had a lot of fun here tonight looking back at the 1990s. And when next up will be in the 2000s, a big decade for Carolina. A lot of things that we'll have to talk through when we look at that decade. You have 3 head coaches in a 6-year span, but 2 national championships on the back end. So we cannot wait to get to that edition of the podcast here sometime in the near future. With that is going to wrap up this edition of the show. In the meantime, guys, we will direct you guys to the website. That's HeelToughBlog.com, where we're still in full-blown football mode. The preseason basketball content will start to filter the site here in the next week or so, but it's Central Florida week this week for Carolina football. Anthony will have you cover the game preview of that later in the week. And, of course, the recap after the game goes final on Saturday. Any news and notes that come out of the program, a player left the program today, we have you covered on that. Injuries, recruiting, we'll have you covered on the football side of things. Same thing for basketball. And as I mentioned, the preseason content will start to flood the site here momentarily. As for the podcast, you guys know where to find us. Every major podcasting platform, simply search the Four Corners Podcast and we will pop up. There, we encourage you guys to rate, review, and subscribe. That way you don't miss any editions of the show throughout the remainder of the basketball off season. For the video content, like and follow us on Facebook, YouTube, or on Twitter. Just search at Heel Tough Blog, and every time that we go live, those places will notify you. So like those pages, follow those pages, and whenever we're on here live, you'll get notified if you want to be a video viewer to the podcast. And we encourage you to do that because a little bit of a tease, we got a pretty big news coming down for both the Four Corners podcast and the Heel Tough Blog podcast, something that should be made official maybe as early as tomorrow, but sometime this week. Some pretty exciting news for us, something I'm pretty excited about that will be coming to the podcast that you will also be able to be involved with. So be on the lookout for that announcement sometime later in the week. But with that, guys, that is going to wrap up this edition of the show. I do want to thank Anthony once again for hosting with me. We want to thank you guys for watching and listening. And as always, go Tar Heels.